This is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the program. Our top stories. China's senior diplomat Wang Yi meets U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Indonesia. The latest in a series of high-profile diplomatic interactions between the world's superpowers. Our other headlines: a third successive night of attacks on Ukraine's capital. At least one person is killed, but officials say the city's air defenses are working. And the leader of Thailand's most popular party says he won't give up on his bid to become Prime Minister after Parliament failed to support him. China's senior diplomat Wang Yi has met U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Indonesia. It's the latest in a series of high-profile diplomatic interactions between the world's two biggest economies. The talks took place on the sidelines of a meeting of foreign ministers from the Association of Southeast Asian Countries. It's the second such meeting between the two high-ranking officials in as many months. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Roblyn Perber, in Jakarta. Roblyn, so the latest in several meetings between these high-profile diplomats. What was on their agenda? Do we know?
Yes, definitely. Now, if I can talk about the top Chinese diplomat, Wang Yi, that met with U.S. Foreign Secretary Blinken. What I can tell you on that is that we are expecting them to talk about opportunities and challenges that existed between the two of the world's largest economies, and there are conflicting interests when it comes to trade as well. I would definitely say that the world is watching and hoping that the two superpowers can ease the tensions, as conflict between the two would impact other nations, developing nations at that. And we're also expecting talks on the climate crisis as well, as the two countries previously cooperated on climate change, which resulted to the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. And climate envoy John Kerry is due to travel to Beijing soon.
Now, there's a second important meeting to talk about, the meeting between Wang Yi and Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
Right, so China's top diplomat Wang Yi also met with Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov in Jakarta, and they reaffirmed ties, vowing to collaborate to strengthen regional cooperation. And Wang Yi also highlighted the important high-level contacts between Beijing and Moscow in the coming months. Now, Wang Yi and Lavrov, they discussed international efforts to launch the peace negotiation process on the Ukraine crisis. Now, the meetings in Jakarta will continue until Saturday.
Roblyn, thank you for that. Our correspondent Roblyn Perber in Jakarta. There's been a third successive night of Russian drone attacks on Ukraine's capital. Officials in Kyiv say 20 Russian attack drones and 2 cruise missiles were shot down in the early hours of Thursday. A body was later found in an apartment block, which was reportedly struck by falling debris. Meanwhile, a Ukrainian military spokesperson has said the country has received its first shipment of cluster munitions following a controversial decision by the United States to support them. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Stephanie Freed in Kyiv. Stephanie, what more do we know about these latest strikes?
Jamie, as you said, this is the third successive night of drone strikes. The first night, 28 were launched, 26 intercepted. The second night, 15 launched, 11 intercepted. And then overnight last night, 20 that Ukraine says, the military says they intercepted all of them. Damage in Kyiv, several people injured. Not quite sure if a person who was killed at the site of one of the drone strikes was killed because of that or something else. Conflicting reports there. But there seems to be a pattern. There was linkage certainly to the NATO summit with the other drone strikes. But overnight, let's say last night, now it seems like more, again, like a pattern. And also you noted these cruise missiles, the Caliber missiles. Ukraine's military also saying that they were launched from the Black Sea onto the city of Mykolaiv. And it's unclear, it seems that they were intercepted as well. So it seems that Ukraine's military, they are pridefully saying that their success rate in interception is quite high. Jamie?
Ukraine says it's now received that controversial first delivery of cluster munitions.
That's right. That's being reported by a military official. Controversial, as you noted, because of the nature of cluster munitions. Interesting how quickly they arrived. The U.S. pledged, as part of an $800 million weapons package to Ukraine. Part of that was the cluster munitions. That was less than a week ago. So for now, the announcement to be forthcoming that the cluster munitions have arrived, very speedy. Why are they controversial? Because they're bomblets that when they drop as bomblets, they spread out. And it's not specific, not precise in targeting. They often have about up to a 40% rate of not exploding, which means later unsuspecting people may come across them and be harmed or killed. Nonetheless, this, Ukraine says, will give it the advantage right now in the current campaign. Jamie.
Stephanie, thank you for that. Our correspondent Stephanie Fries in Kyiv. Well, a top Russian general says he has been dismissed after protesting to his superiors about conditions on Ukraine's front lines. Major General Ivan Popov has blamed a lack of military support for what he says are the mass deaths of Russian forces fighting in Ukraine. He repeated his claims in a voice message to his soldiers via the messaging platform Telegram.
I called things out for what they were. I drew the attention of the officers to the main tragedy of the modern war. It's the absence of counter-battery, the absence of intelligence on the whereabouts of the enemy's artillery, and the mass deaths and severe injuries of our brothers caused by the enemy's artillery. I also highlighted other problems. I spoke out at the highest level. I was sincere and firm.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow. Dasha, this seems to be the strongest attack yet on the Russian military campaign in Ukraine. It's come from one of their own generals. Has there been a response to his words in Moscow?
Well, we haven't heard any response coming directly from the Kremlin, as it is typically the case, but we have heard some reactions coming from some senior Russian politicians, including from Andrei Kartapolov, who is the head of Russia's State Duma Defense Committee, who has suggested that Popov is a good general and he is a very prospective general. So he suggested that we just have to wait and see how it all develops. He also has been stressing that Popov should be serving in the Russian army, and also said that overall situation in the Russian army should be, of course, addressed, but he also stressed that the Russian army is completing the tasks that have been set to it, that is, repelling all the Ukrainian attacks and also making advancements on certain directions. We have recently heard from the Russian MOD that they have managed to make even some gains during its military campaign in Ukraine while repelling the attacks of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And also we have heard that those issues that have been raised could be resolved, and a politician from the from Russia's Council of the Federation, who is a member of Russia's United Party, has also been saying that that communication from Popov was meant to be kept in private, not in the public space. So certainly there's been no comment directly from the Kremlin, but these issues are being taken care of.
I want to ask you about another senior Russian general. It was confirmed earlier this week that another senior military figure had been killed in Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia region. I mean, is there a sense of, can you give us a sense of whether this changes the Kremlin's military plans for Ukraine?
Well, as we keep hearing from the Russian leadership is that the situation on the battlefield remains the same. Russia keeps repelling the Ukrainian attacks as part of Ukraine's counteroffensive that Moscow says has been largely unsuccessful. Moscow also insists that the production of Russia's military-industrial complex has been accelerated and Russia is producing more weapons for the needs of the ongoing special military operation in Ukraine. Moscow has been also saying that at the moment it has enough troops to fight in Ukraine. So the idea of yet another wave of mobilization in Russia has been ruled out by the Russian authorities, with the leadership stressing that there are enough volunteers who have been joining the Russian army and also under the contract. So certainly at the moment, the Russian authorities keep reassuring the public that they keep fighting in Ukraine. But morally wise, we have also heard the Russian authorities insisting on the idea that this fight is important for Russia's sovereignty, because repeatedly we keep hearing about more types of weapons being supplied to Ukraine, including most recently the idea of cluster munitions that, as we have heard, are now arriving in Ukraine. So Russia suggests that to fight those threats that are being created by the NATO countries and the United States primarily, Russia is forced to continue its operation in Ukraine.
Dasha, thank you for that. Our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow. Turkey's President Erdogan says Sweden's NATO membership can only be ratified once Ankara's parliament reopens in October. And he stressed that before then, Stockholm must, as he said, take steps against terrorism in return for the approval. Our correspondent Mikhail Bardavid reports.
After the conclusion of the NATO summit in Vilnius, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan reiterated that he believes the Turkish parliament will ratify Sweden's NATO membership bid. However, he added it would only happen after Turkish lawmakers return from their summer recess. Erdogan emphasized that Sweden will provide a roadmap outlining the measures it intends to take against terrorism before the ratification takes place. On Monday, during a meeting hosted by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, Turkey and Sweden agreed on a new bilateral security compact that will meet annually at a ministerial level. After the talks, Stoltenberg also announced that NATO, for the first time, would establish a post of special coordinator for counter-terrorism. Some analysts stress that this development is critical for Ankara.
Turkey has been expecting support from NATO in its fight against terrorism since the 1990s. For the first time, Turkey formally requested an official response to this support. The establishment of a structure related to counterterrorism has been included in a NATO document for the first time, which is a significant achievement.
Also held several bilateral talks on the sidelines of the NATO summit, including a meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden. Though both Turkey and the United States claim the sale of F-16 fighter jets to Ankara was not dependent on Turkey's lifting its opposition to Sweden's bid to join the alliance, following the talks with Biden, Erdogan expressed confidence that the sale will go through.
Both the US President Joe Biden and the Secretary of State Antony Blinken said they will follow up on the issue of F-16 sales to Turkey. It is our hope that we will receive a positive outcome in this process. I am more hopeful than ever.
Erdogan also brought focus to Turkey's EU membership process during his talks in Vilnius. In the joint statement between Turkey and Sweden, Stockholm has pledged to actively support efforts to reinvigorate Turkey's EU accession process. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also stated that Turkey's relationship with the European Union was on the agenda ahead of his talks with Erdogan. Some political analysts, such as Filiz Katman, emphasized that Erdogan's last-minute approval for Sweden before the NATO Vilnius summit strategically positioned him as the center of attention, highlighting Turkey's role in the region. Mikhail Bardavid, CGTN, Istanbul.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Defeated, at least for now, the man hoping to be Thailand's next Prime Minister says he won't give up after failing to win Parliament's backing. And calls for a pause on deep-sea mining amid fears it's the new frontier for valuable metals and minerals.
Roger, Ricky, last clear. we can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come, and this idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN, see the difference.
This week on Raise Up, creating the power of the sun here on Earth.
We will have endless energy. Could replace the oil. It will for sure change our life, change the world a lot. We are working on this project. It's like when humans learn how to use fire. This is the second fire of the human in our history.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. China's senior diplomat Wang Yi meets US Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Indonesia, the latest in a series of high-profile diplomatic interactions between the world's superpowers. Our other headlines: the third successive night of attacks on Ukraine's capital. At least one person is killed, but officials say city defences are working. The leader of Thailand's most popular political party says he will not give up on his bid to become Prime Minister after Parliament failed to support him. Peter Limjaroenrat's Move Forward party won the most seats in the recent general election, but he needs Parliament's endorsement to take up the premiership. He could get a second chance next week when another vote in Parliament is expected. Let's talk to our correspondent, Chawarat Yonjiranon in Bangkok. Peter's party won the elections, but he lost the vote in Parliament. Why is that?
Actually, this is a repeat of history, you could say, because of the fact that in the past we've seen opposing parties that have gained a large amount of support during the general election and then have been met with a lot of opposition in Parliament. We also have to keep in mind that this Parliament was set by the military after the coup d'etat. So all of the various components of it are still pretty much military backed. So when you see the results where he has gotten 324 votes, short of the 375 votes that he needs to be prime minister, it's not a surprise. And when you take a look at the senators that have voted, it was only at the number of 34. Many people kind of expected this, but at the same time, we really have to see how this will impact the sentiment for the pro Move Forward party, his party, who are on the streets. They were on the streets yesterday. They're on the streets today. What he really represents right now is a new wave of young voters that had voted for him during the past election, where there has been a move for institutional reforms, dismantling of monopolies, and most significantly, the changing or amendment of the lèse-majesté law in terms of how the monarchy is dealt with. And this is probably the fact why he has been receiving such opposition in Parliament, because there are very hardcore royalists in the Parliament. And as we can see here, next week could be a repeat of what has happened today.
From the outside, this really does feel like one of those sort of change moments for the country. I mean, do you get a sense that this really is going to be a significant moment for Thailand?
It really depends on the amount of people that are backing this new party, because of the fact that in the past, real movement have been coming out from those who really go on the streets. And let's keep in mind, though, that at the same time, we have the royalists that have been known to be on the streets as well. So there is a possibility that there could be a clash at a time where really Thailand is seeking to have an economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. The private sector has voiced its view that there needs to be a clear government for this recovery. At the same time, if he fails to, he says he will run again for prime minister candidacy next week. If he fails to get that support, we're going to have to see how it's going to impact his coalition government, whether the Pheu Thai party, another big opposition party, will take up the mantle into premiership, and whether or not there's going to be more opposition to that as well.
Jawara Yonjiranon in Bangkok, thank you very much indeed. Exports from China have fallen at their fastest pace since the start of the pandemic. Outbound shipments from the world's second largest economy were down 12.4% in June. That's compared to the same period last year. The figures are worse than expected. China's government has blamed a weak global economic recovery and rising geopolitical tension. The European Union has lifted the last remaining restrictions on food imports from Japan linked to the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Curbs have been in place since the accident in 2011 affecting fish products and wild mushrooms from Fukushima and its surrounding areas. Under the restrictions, such products were only allowed to enter the EU if they were shown to not contain excessive levels of radioactive material. Chinese regulators have finalised the country's first rules on generative artificial intelligence as they look to get ahead of the rapidly growing technology. The regulations will cover AI services like ChatGPT, capable of generating content such as text and images, and will require providers to obtain licenses, deal with illegal content, and protect private user information. Extreme weather continues to wreak havoc in the United States. More than 50 million people across the southwest of the country are under a heat alert as blistering temperatures scorch the entire region. While in the northeast of the country, residents are clearing up mud and debris following catastrophic flooding. Our correspondent Tony Waterman reports.
On the hottest days of summer, Maria Lodi likes to take her dog Trooper to Barton Springs, literally the coolest place in Austin. Natural underwater springs keep the swimming hole at a consistent 68 degrees Fahrenheit, or 20 degrees Celsius. Right now, that means the water is nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than the air temperature.
This has been the hottest it's ever been. It's me and my boyfriend, we just bring our lawn chairs and we just sit in here, and we bring our dogs and we're just relaxing.
Texas, along with much of the southern U.S., is in the grips of another slow-moving, suffocating heat wave. Much of the state is under an excessive heat warning.
Summers are starting to get hotter and hotter. I don't know what's wrong with the climate, but I'm not a scientist, but it's something's definitely changing for sure.
Even in areas used to the heat, temperatures are pushing new extremes. Phoenix, Arizona has seen 12 consecutive days of over 110 degrees, with no let-up in sight. Portions of the state are expected to flirt with 120 by the weekend. Officials urging people to stay indoors after a record 425 heat-related deaths last summer in Maricopa County alone.
Heat is a really serious public health hazard. We don't talk about it as seriously as we should all across the United States.
As residents in the South swelter in the heat, residents in the Northeast are starting the long, grueling task of digging out from catastrophic flooding. Storms dumping a summer's worth of rain in a matter of days. The picturesque streets of Montpelier, Vermont, submerged by floodwaters.
I'm crying. My entire store is upended. My freezers are all over the place. The stock that I had up 3 feet is now all over the floor.
Vermont officials on Wednesday saying more than 200 people have been rescued, mostly from remote mountain towns. And while the sun has now broken through, more rain is forecast in the coming days.
This may not be over. With rain in the forecast and nowhere for it to go, we could see waters rise again.
The heat wave here in the south is also expected to drag on into next week. Most experts agree that extreme weather events like we've seen in recent days will only get more common as global temperatures continue to rise. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Austin, Texas.
A growing list of countries are calling for a moratorium on deep-sea mining as United Nations talks take place to determine the future of the industry. There's concern over the environmental impact from collecting metals from the seabed needed for the world's transition to green energy. But it's not all opposition. Many countries are in favour. Our correspondent Catherine Drew reports.
In the 1980s, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea came into force, declaring 54% of the world's oceans as common heritage of mankind. In other words, it belonged to everyone, and mining in the area was to be banned until a mining code could be agreed. To draw up this code, the International Seabed Authority was established in the Jamaican capital, Kingston, in 1994. But there has never been any agreement. In 2021, the Pacific Island nation of Nauru, working with Canadian mining firm The Metals Company, applied to start deep-sea mining in the common area, triggering a 2-year deadline for the body to come up with such a code or allow mining. The deadline passed in early July. Now, major countries, including France, Germany and Chile, are calling for a pause on all deep-sea mining operations in these common areas, where mining exploration has already prompted protests. However, nations including Norway, China and South Korea are in favour of pushing ahead. The prize? Minerals and metals including cobalt, copper and nickel, used for green technologies such as wind turbines, solar panels and EV batteries.
If deep-sea mining were to go ahead on the scale that is currently planned, it would essentially be the largest mining operation in the history of humanity.
But environmental groups fear the mining could have catastrophic consequences, destroying ecosystems that are still little understood and creating sediment clouds that could suffocate corals and sea life miles from the mining site.
The deep sea environment is particularly vulnerable and fragile, and it's a very slow-moving environment. Things take a long time to grow, a long time to reproduce. There's no going back from any of the impacts from deep sea mining. The impacts would be irreversible.
And scientists also have concerns that the effects of extraction could have unforeseen consequences.
It is like going into a new frontier with a technology that's just now being developed. And my feeling about it is that we should only be doing that if we know enough about the ecosystems, we know what lives there, what we stand to lose, and how they're linked to, say, the fisheries above the mining areas. We need to have a tremendous amount of knowledge before we can effectively regulate such a risky industry.
However, mining firm The Metals Company says the biggest threat to the oceans is climate change and insists the top priority of the planet should be achieving net zero emissions as fast as possible. A statement on their website reads, "Staying dependent on fossil fuels will continue to contribute to a host of environmental and climate issues. Ocean acidification, oil spills, toxic byproducts and resource wars among them." This environmental disagreement is being played out at the International Seabed Authority talks in Jamaica as countries wrestle with the dilemma of whether to collect precious metals and minerals from the seabed. Catherine Drew, CGTN.
And finally, the Miao ethnic group is celebrating their Canoe Dragon Boat Festival in China's Guangzhou province. Paddlers adopt this standing position, rather different from the style of the Han ethnic group. The dragon head is exquisitely decorated, as it's considered a sacred object for the Miao people. The headlines again. China's senior diplomat Wang Yi meets US Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Indonesia, the latest in a series of high-profile diplomatic interactions between the world's superpowers. Our other headlines: a third successive night of attacks on Ukraine's capital. At least one person is killed, but officials say the city's air defences are working. And the leader of Thailand's most popular party says he won't give up on his ambition to become Prime Minister after Parliament failed to support him. And that is The World Today. Thank you for watching. We're back with more news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.